Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today. I can see there's lots of people still coming in from the waiting room, but we've got a fairly packed agenda, and I want to leave us as much time as possible for the question and answer session at the end. So we will get started now, and hopefully anyone joining a couple of minutes later can get caught up. So, as many of you know, each year we undertake a fairly significant exercise to map out the soy, palm, cocoa, and coffee supply chains for about 20 different retail, food service, and manufacturing businesses. And that involves engaging over 1,500 suppliers. And I know lots of you are with us today. So, for those of you that have been part of that reporting process, whether as a participating company or a supplier, just to reiterate from all of the team at Freakill, I suppose a really big thank you, because without the time and effort that you've put into the process, we wouldn't be able to get this really valuable market level view that we're able to share with everybody today. In terms of what to expect over the next hour, we'll be having a look back to see what the data we've collected from 2025 is able to tell us. We'll be highlighting some of the on-the-ground challenges that we've heard during our conversations with companies all the way across the supply chain. And we'll also be having a look ahead to see what we can do next to tackle the remaining gaps to deforestation and conversion-free supply. We'll have a bit of time at the end for questions and answers, so do feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may need to click that little three dots with more in order to find the Q&A, but it should be there for you to ask your questions. We will answer as many questions as we possibly can, but of course we can't answer everything, and we can't answer anything that might compromise data anonymity or touch on anything that's commercially sensitive, really. On which note, I suppose just to say everything that we're sharing today is very much aggregated at market level, so not attributable to any single company. And much of the content that we're sharing with you today will also be published in our public report, which is coming out next week. So for those of you who've signed up and said that you're okay to receive our emails, that will be popping over to you after this, but it will be available on the website as well for you to download, share with your colleagues, and so on. So before we get stuck in, just some quick introductions to the team here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a principal consultant at Freakill. I've been working on deforestation risk commodities with the team for around about 7 years now. And for the last 2 years, I've had the pleasure of leading the collective reporting process, which we're talking through today. I'm joined by Becky, who's also a principal consultant here at Freakill and also joined 7 years ago. She's led the analysis team for the collective reporting process this year, so really knows the data inside and out, and she's also going to be taking over as programme manager for the next reporting cycle as well. And finally, we're joined by Bella. Many of you will already know Bella quite well or recognise her name because she's been the technical support lead for the programme over the last 2 years. She's helped many of yourselves and suppliers navigate through the reporting process. Bella and Becky have both played really huge roles in this reporting cycle, and they're really the experts, so really pleased to be joined by them both today. And for those of you who might be a little bit less familiar with Freakill as well, we're an evidence-led sustainability consultancy specialising in supply chains, food systems, and landscapes. And because of how we're set up, we're in a really nice, unique position when it comes to tackling complex challenges like deforestation and land conversion. We've got 3 kind of core business units that work side by side and really complement each other's work. So we've got our specialists in agriculture and landscapes who really focus on improving production practices at farm level. We've got our climate, nature and resources team who work closely with businesses on their overarching sustainability strategies, greenhouse gas accounting, climate risk, and lots of other areas as well. And then for the 3 of us today, we're part of the commodity supply chains team. And our real kind of core day-to-day focus is around helping businesses to identify and address deforestation, environmental and social risks within their commodity sourcing. We also have, and I've got to give a shout out to our Landscape Enterprise Networks team, who also sit within 3Keel. That's a fantastic program bringing together businesses, public bodies, NGOs, farmers to co-fund regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions. They've recently won the King's Award for Enterprise for Innovation in recognition of the impact of their work. So very, very proud of them over there. And finally, just to mention an exciting milestone for us from the past few months is that we've recently joined forces with Vera Science to bring their scientific technical expertise along our advisory work as well. They specialise in technical services and innovation to protect food, people, and the environment. So we're really excited at what's coming up next in that partnership. For our commodity supply chains team, we've got a number of different areas that we work in. So today we're really focusing on the supply chain mapping side of things, but actually the work that we do in supply chain mapping and some of the findings that we're talking through today can really feed into the other areas of work that we do as well. So roadmaps and strategy work that we support companies with, and then some of those coalitions that we convene as well. So before handing over to Becky, just a minute or so really, I suppose, to talk you through a bit of background context on this year's collective reporting programme before we head into the findings. So lots of numbers here, but we worked with 20 different clients to engage thousands of different companies across the supply chain on their soy, palm, coffee and cocoa sourcing. Over 1,500 companies responded and gave us really detailed information on that commodity sourcing as well. And really the core focus of what we do is to deliver specific reporting back to the participating companies, so retail, food service and manufacturing. We also now have this incredibly rich, unique data set across these commodities and across multiple markets that we can use to pull out industry-wide findings, spot major trends, and inform kind of future action for the whole sector. You will notice that today we're speaking more on soy, palm, and cocoa. That's because we've got a much larger number of companies engaging here, so the data set we have is more representative of the broader market. The other thing I would say is that we're kind of slightly more UK focused than anything else. The markets we look at do go globally, kind of, yeah, globally and EU wide. But the best coverage we've got really is of that UK market as well. So some of the examples that we'll talk through will be quite UK specific. The second context piece really to highlight is that 2025, which is the year of data we're looking at, was really set to be a milestone year for sustainability commitments. We saw really clear expectations set by SBTI, the UK Soy Manifesto and others, aiming for fully deforestation-free supply chains by the time we reach the end of 2025. If you'd read our public report last year, you will have seen we didn't really shy away from highlighting that there would be significant progress needed from 2024 to 2025 in order to meet those targets. And it probably won't be a surprise to many of you to see when Becky's talking through the data that expectation for fully deforestation conversion free wasn't widely met across the market at that point. But that being said, it's not all bad news. We've seen progress in the past year and over the years we've been doing the reporting. And there's also some successes which we wanted to highlight today that we can kind of think about building on in the future as well. So Becky and Bella will cover three sort of key areas today. The where are we now, what progress has been made towards those 2025 commitments, what examples are there of strategies that are already working to achieve deforestation free? And then what next? Where do we go from here? So I'll hand over to Becky to speak through those first points.
Thanks very much, Sian, and hello everyone. As Sian said, I am the person who's been sort of beavering away behind the scenes, working with the analysis team from our side, processing a lot of this data. So excited to be able to share some of this with you now. So I'm going to dive right in to have a look at some of the kind of overall findings that we had from looking kind of across all of the different supply chains of all of the companies who were involved. And so, yeah, as Sean was saying, 2025 was this kind of big, almost cliff edge year for many companies, for lots of commitments with 2025 deadlines. Obviously, I guess just to reiterate, a lot of people had targets for end of 2025, so weren't necessarily expecting to see the full picture of 2025 as being exactly there and at those target points. But as Sean was mentioning, we were expecting to basically see a lot of progress down the track towards deforestation and conversion free in order for companies to be sort of within reaching distance of hitting those targets. And what we've seen this year is that there is still this gap to these 2025 ambitions. So when we look across these different commodities, so as Sean mentioned, we'll be focusing on soy, palm oil, and cocoa. You can see these are the kind of snapshot overview pictures when we're looking at all of the volumes of these commodities that were reported to us for the 2025 year. What proportion of those were being reported as being verified deforestation and conversion free? And it is a mixed picture across the board, and this is very indicative of kind of the background of what these commodities are like and the kind of supply chains that they have, where we can see palm oil, for example, with quite a high percentage, so 82% being claimed as vDCF and a further 14% as being in a form of in transition. So, for example, using a mass balance form of certification, for example. Whereas for soy, we can see that that's a lot lower at 20% vDCF and 37% in transition. And for cocoa, where we see predominantly mass balance still being used within the supply chain, we can see it's just 1% that's actually being reported as being vDCF for the 2025 year, whereas there is actually a huge level of certification being used where 97% is then in transition. So overall, hugely 98% is being covered by some form of certification, but the majority of that can't be claimed as being verified deforestation and conversion free under the definitions. Similarly, a big part of kind of moving towards vDCF has also been around that sort of traceability and trying to improve traceability, particularly in those commodities where there are limitations on certification, where actually being able to evidence origin more strongly is seen as one of the better routes to be able to demonstrate vDCF. And you can see that there's actually still some significant gaps to go with those as well. For example, for soy, it's really, and for palm, really, we're just talking about a bit over half of all of the volumes being able to actually have a country of origin disclosed alongside them. Much higher with cocoa, 82%, so much higher view of transparency there, but you can still see these significant gaps where this information isn't being disclosed at the moment. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress. There has definitely been progress, and we have seen things moving forward. It has been mixed, a mixed picture between different commodities but even sort of more granularly than that between different actors within those supply chains as well. So for palm, we can see actually if we look at just the companies who have participated across the previous 3 years of reporting, so 2025 to 2023, we can see that actually it's been a relatively stagnating picture for the overall view. And between food and non-food, there is a really significant gap, and that gap still remains. So, for food, we're looking at much higher levels of segregated or identity preserved levels of certification within the supply chain, whereas for non-food, despite all of the efforts that have been going on behind the scenes with sort of working groups around oleochemicals and derivatives, we can see that there's still been a lag in that kind of increasing. It has been making progress, but it's still nowhere near where we're seeing everything within food. When we flip that over to soy and we look at things in terms of looking at the overall, but also then the retail market versus those who are manufacturers or food service and non-retail, we can see there is a significant difference between those groups in terms of the level of vDCF claims within the supply chain. But overall, we can see that is an upward trend, and we can see the movement. But if you have a look at the scale on the left-hand side of the soy one, you can see actually though it looks like a good positive movement, there is still a long, long way to go with soy for it to get to the same levels of vDCF claims as we're seeing within the palm industry. For those who have been involved or seen our reports in previous years, this won't come as a huge surprise. We consistently see that there is a small group of suppliers of companies who make up a huge portion of the overall footprint. So a really not significant amount of suppliers will make up 80% of the total volume of the commodities reported within the supply chain. That's true of most individual companies who are the convening companies who bring their supply chains together, but also even when we look across the board at the broader picture across these commodities, across all of the supply chains we're looking at, it's actually a really small number of actors who actually have quite a significant impact on the overall proportions of the volumes, and therefore the most impact on how much things can progress and change. However, even when we just filter down what we're looking at to look at this core group, the progress is quite uneven that we're seeing kind of across the board. So for soy, for example, the ones on the left-hand side, you can see that actually as we move year on year, rather than seeing people progress through in terms of this is around people being able to say they'll be able to demonstrate verified deforestation-free supply and whether or not they've got a plan on how to get there, you can actually see that we've actually had a bit of a drop back. So whereas in 2024, the 15 of those companies were saying that they'd adopted a plan, by 2025, it was actually dropped down to 7, and more had then gone into this developing plan bucket. So we can see that there are actually some cases where people are kind of dropping back and going from having policies that are adopted to actually going back to the drawing board, working on what that looks like, either because the routes they'd opted to try and head for aren't available or aren't ones that they feel like they're able to do at the moment, or because of the changing goalposts around things, for example, with EUDR, creating uncertainty within the industry and making people rethink where they're heading towards. Whereas palm is a slightly different view, but here we're seeing again this kind of slight stagnation where we're seeing companies being sat for multiple years of having a plan that's in progress that isn't actually developed yet and isn't published yet, but is still being created, and companies not actually flowing through to then having those plans adopted and working through on them, but instead just sitting for multiple years with it in progress. Similarly, when we look at transparency, to be able to see what's going on, for people to have a clear view of what's happening within the supply chain, this is something that we expected to see some significant movement on, particularly in light of EUDR, where there was the need for the information flow to come through that bit clearer from certain parts of the markets. It's again a bit of a mixed picture. So for Origin, we have seen this increasing for disclosure. So again, this is for companies who've participated across all 3 years. And we can see that for both palm and for soy, there's been this increase in the proportion that's being able to be linked to specific origins. However, for importer, though, we have seen that increasing for soy a bit more gradually than we have done for origin, but we can see it still increasing the disclosure of those things. For palm, it's actually stagnated and even dropped slightly in terms of the proportion that's actually being able to be linked to a specific importer. And that is something we've actually seen reduce year on year across the last 3 years. So it's not necessarily the picture I think some were expecting of increased disclosure around these kind of particular things, but it's this gap of information flow through the supply chain which can cause particular problems about being able to evidence vDCF within the supply chain. And when we're thinking about that kind of evidence gap, just to kind of zoom out a little bit from kind of this view we have of the supply chain to just think about that kind of bigger picture, overall, if we an estimate, say for soy, of around about 97% of soy production, maybe even more, isn't linked to any form of deforestation or conversion. However, once we get through all the different layers of the supply chain in terms of the evidence flow and the documentation flow through the supply chain, we're only seeing around about 20% of volumes being claimed to be vDCF. So there is this kind of gap in terms of what we know is out there and what we know is available, and the ability for people further downstream to be able to actually evidence that, or to get the information, the transparency that that's the case for them and for their supply chain. So I'm going to hand over to Bella now for her to be able to go through some more sort of specific details around what that looks like from conversations with suppliers.
Thanks, Becky. So from our supplier engagement this year, there was definitely a marked increase in the emphasis that suppliers were placing on the importance of certification, low risk origin, and evidence reporting. So specifically looking at soy, evidence reporting is a real challenge because there are so many different routes to deforestation and conversion free, many different certification schemes, many potential origins. And as a result, we run an evidence review process to check the validity of suppliers' claims. And what we saw from our supplier engagement was that even though there was this increased emphasis and desire to report more deforestation and conversion-free soy, there were still blockers, as Becky mentioned, to the flow of this information throughout the supply chain. Some of these blockers are things that we've been aware of for many years. So in tandem with the reporting process, we also piloted a scheme this year with Dairy UK to try and overcome some of these data gaps, which I will talk to in a bit more detail shortly. Oh, I move on to the next slide. So what did the evidence actually look like for soy this year? So overall, the quality of evidence that was reported from the certification claims improved significantly. So in 2025, at the end of the reporting process, off the back of all of our engagement with suppliers, over 60% of evidence that was reported was rated as sufficient. This is a large improvement compared to previous years. So last year, under half of evidence was seen as sufficient. So this is a real kind of win for this year. A lot of the evidence that we saw reported for soy was actually evidence of low risk origin sourcing. So we were seeing suppliers moving to sourcing from North America and Europe to align with their customers' voluntary commitments and prepare for EUDR as well. And looking at each sector, sort of the breakdown of evidence reporting by sector, you can see that seafood continued to perform really well in terms of evidence reporting, but dairy performed sort of the least well in terms of valid evidence reported. But actually, dairy, the figures here are a huge improvement on previous years, which I will explain in a moment. So that's kind of where we are now. But what strategies are there to try and accelerate progress towards deforestation and conversion-free commodities? So there are various different strategies that we're seeing already being used. There's no one size fits all approach across commodities, and each approach kind of has pros and cons as well. So firstly, we have trusted suppliers. So looking at dairy again, an example of this is we've been working to gather information from feed mills to improve transparency and performance. For soy within seafood, you also have SPC traders who have a commitment that they've been upholding for many years to achieve deforestation and conversion-free soy, and that's contributed to the performance of seafood as a sector. Certification remains the most common approach to DCF. And we see this particularly with RSPO certification for palm, which is kind of the the main kind of approach to achieving DCF. A limitation of certification for other commodities outside of palm is that segregated or identity preserved are the only two forms of certification which can actually be used to show that a commodity is deforestation and conversion free 100% without anything else mixed in, and availability of these materials is limited for other commodities such as cocoa and soy. Moving on to substitution, so with voluntary commitments and legislative requirements becoming more pressing, we've seen examples from our engagement with suppliers of companies moving away from sourcing high-risk commodities, so moving away from including palm oil in food, moving away from including soy in feed. In addition, with climate change, the actual availability of some commodities is becoming more limited. So we saw in 2023 swollen shoot and black pod disease for cocoa. Increased cocoa prices and meant that some companies were turning towards substitution. The limitation of substitution as an approach is that there can be unintended consequences. So a risk assessment is always needed before deciding to make substitutes for these commodities. And the final approach is sourcing from lower risk origins. So this is most commonly seen in soy. And to put a statistic on the finding that I mentioned earlier, we've seen a massive increase in low risk origins reported this year, mostly driven by aggregated supply chains like pork and eggs. So 18% of soy was declared as from low risk origins in 2025, compared to just 8% in 2023. The caveat to low risk origins, as you might kind of be aware already, is that some companies, I guess for, say, North America, WWF has been campaigning for several years to increase recognition of the Great Plains as a high-risk sourcing region. So what is deemed high risk and low risk can change over time and can, be a source of scrutiny and discussion. So looking into more detail at kind of the approaches that have been taken to close the gaps that I mentioned earlier within the dairy sector. To give you a bit of background, dairy is the third largest consumer of soy in the UK, and most feed production occurs on many small farms, and decisions on the feed used are often made by individual farmers. In addition to this, the feed mixes used on dairy farms can vary throughout the year. So because of these factors, even if data is available, it can be very difficult to gather it all and draw conclusions about the DCF status of soy used in dairy as a whole. So to overcome these challenges, significant progress has been made in 2025. So firstly, we've been working with dairy suppliers who've been able to report on the certification status of their soy in feed for the first time by incorporating questions on the DCF status of the soy and feed into existing farm audit processes. So this has meant that some significant dairy suppliers have been able to report for the first time on the physical certification and the origin status of dairy, whereas previously they wouldn't have had this level of visibility and would have relied on credits for certification. In parallel with this, as I mentioned before, 3Keel has been working with Dairy UK to pilot an approach targeting feed mills and gathering data from further upstream within the supply chain to be able to draw conclusions about the status of soy in dairy as a sector. So both approaches in tandem with each other have led to significant improvements within kind of the dairy reporting this year, although there is still a long way to go, as we've seen. So looking at the Dairy UK pilot, we worked with Dairy UK to gather information directly from feed mills sourcing into the dairy industry. So this has allowed us to get better representation of the actions being taken by the dairy sector as a whole and gather market level statistics. It's also led to more streamlined reporting of deforestation and conversion-free metrics, which we're hoping is eventually going to allow us to make conclusions further down the supply chain about soy and feed for dairy. And you can see the impact here of that pilot. So approximately 52% of soy meal in all UK dairy feed was profiled. And this was gathering data from feed mills of all sizes. And you can see the 2024 figures on the left there compared to the 2025 figures. So vDCF claims with the Dairy UK profile applied to the soy reported increased vDCF claims from 3% to 14%. And then origin visibility and first importer visibility improved dramatically as well. So overall, we've seen this pilot as a success, which can hopefully be applied in future years. So some interesting findings from the pilot. So we can see that it significantly reduced the burden on farmers and manufacturers. And then within the pilot as well, not all feed compound mixes distinguished between dairy and non-dairy, which was an interesting finding. So it was looking kind of at a more aggregated level at feed mill data. And then finally, the progress being driven within the dairy sector, we found was actually being driven by other sectors such as poultry and pork. So these findings kind of give us opportunities to make this approach more established and formalize the approach. It's also kind of more kind of based on self-reporting. So we'd want to kind of look at backing the findings with evidence. And then there are also interesting implications for kind of gathering information from feed mills and working with them to support transitions towards DCF soy in future. So I'll pass back on to Becky now for what comes next.
Thanks very much for that, Bella. Yeah, so I guess just a couple of reflections on some of the bits that we've just been through and what those kind of mean. So, you know, regardless of the different routes that we've been talking about, and we have seen those kind of routes emerging and growing over time, certification is still the most widely used route for demonstrating deforestation and conversion free across all of the commodities. That's something it's kind of here to stay. We've seen, obviously high levels of segregation in supply chains like palm oil, but we're still seeing a huge use of mass balance as well within the soy and cocoa supply chains too. We have seen an improvement in transparency, and some of that has been driven specifically by, customer policies around disclosure of these things and sort of an increasing level of expectation for the disclosure from customers over time, and also from elements like EUDR, for example, coming in and an expectation around having increasing transparency for those. However, there are significant gaps that still remain that haven't yet been closed out. And the third point is around kind of harmonizing sector-wide asks. It's something that, thinking back over all of these years that we've been running this process, it's something that we've seen really drive change in terms of having a consistent ask from the supply chain, which is clear and easy to communicate through, but also around minimizing reporting burdens on the actors within the supply chains, to make sure that it's one set of questions, one thing that you know that you're going to have to report against, rather than lots of different multiple requests asking for something slightly different across the supply chain. So I'll come back to it in a minute, but the RSG model policy is one example of that, which I'll run through in a moment. But thinking next around what companies should be doing. So as I mentioned earlier on, and as Sian alluded to, 2025 and the end of 2025 is a bit of a cliff edge for many businesses in terms of client expectations and policies that you will be looking to adhere to, but also in terms of your own policies and commitments yourself as well. And when we're looking forwards now beyond the end of 2025, looking over towards 2030, or even beyond that point, many people are sitting back and assessing exactly what the next steps are for them, especially if they have not been able to hit that 2025 target that they were looking to do. So the Accountability Framework Initiative has brought out some guidance for companies who didn't hit their 2025 target dates. And some of the points that they bring out, just kind of listed here, but around retaining the original commitments and time-bound targets, so not just getting rid of your commitment because it's not quite been met, but then taking a step back and communicating out what were the reasons for missing the target and the milestones, and then around monitoring and strengthening that monitoring moving forwards, around your revised plan of action, basically, of where does that mean that you're at now? Where's the gap to where you need to be? What is it that's stopping you from getting there? And how are you going to measure where you're going to moving forward? And then reporting against that annually. So there's still this push from organizations like the AFI, but also from others as well, that it's not a case of, okay, 2025 is gone, let's just focus on something else. It's what's the next step? What does that mean? What are the tangible steps and actions moving forwards? So when you're thinking about, okay, that's the what, but what is the how? How is that going to be achieved? How can people work towards that? So we lay out a couple of sort of recommendations for different types of organizations within the report that you'll see next week. But I guess just to summarize for the bits that will be most, I guess, relevant and tangible for those who are joining us on the call today. Focusing energy where it matters the most. So as we talked about earlier on, it's actually a relatively small number of key suppliers who have the biggest impact in most supply chains. So really focusing in and renewing those efforts on communicating with those suppliers, setting targets with those suppliers, and monitoring the performance of those companies. And also focusing in on those sectors where there are more challenges, and those can be sort of big structural challenges within those industries, which make it really difficult for them to make progress and move forward. So, for example, with the Dairy UK example, looking for other ways and alternative means of trying to make sure information can flow through, or that there are other ways and methods and routes forward for those more challenging sectors. Seeking to align on expectations. So as I mentioned before, that idea of having a harmonized ask and consistent requests for suppliers. Nobody likes feeling like the goalposts are moving all of the time. And when we hit these points, it can feel like that's what's happening. So I think being, having a clear view forwards, being clear with your supply chain and what that is and what that means, and having clear procurement controls in place across all of your volumes, and that's regardless of your customer as well. So this is another thing as well, as we know that for many of you on the call, not all of your customers will be asking for this, but for your own kind of commitments and for your own ability to kind of drive forward this initiative, looking at that across all of your volumes as well. Supporting investment and not just general investment, but really targeted investment within specific sort of production routes, supporting the traceability goals, increasing supply chain resilience, really targeting in where your resources are being focused to ensure that that can happen in the most effective way, and that it's not spreading a lot of stuff all over the place, but you're really kind of focusing in and targeting on what's going to have the biggest gains for you as a proportion of your overall supply, and what are those big blockers that are preventing things from being able to move forwards. And then working together. So it does come back to the kind of alignment on expectations points, but looking to support the sector-wide efforts and reducing burdens on individual companies by working together wherever possible. This is a big topic. And as we've said, there's a lot of companies who've spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of focus over the last 9 years. We've been running this process, trying to move these forwards. And some of that has been happening individually, and some of that has been happening in more of a collective way, in a pre-competitive and collective way. And where we see people working together in industry associations, we see that that burden can be reduced on individual businesses. So also thinking about how you can work with others to kind of push the progress forwards. I mentioned the RSD model policy earlier on. If you haven't seen it, I would thoroughly recommend, and I think we will be sending out a link to it along with the slides and things to follow up, but thoroughly recommend taking a look. But one of the things it talks about, as well as looking at kind of aligned model idea of an aligned view across multiple different actors of what you can be asking for clarity within the supply chain. Also looking at what those alternatives are to certification. We've seen that for many of the commodities, certification has kind of reached a bit of a limit, or it's moving things, but there are barriers within some supply chains, which just means that it's not moving fast enough to be able to kind of address the issues that we're looking at. So what are those other options, for example, around trader control systems that could be used to try and help make sure that things are moving forwards? And it's not just a case of, asking for segregated and hearing back that it's not available, it's too expensive, it's not able to be done. Okay, what are the alternatives then within that supply chain, and what does that look like moving forwards? And I guess one other big point is government action is really, really important. I think we all know that there have been a lot of delays around deforestation-free legislation. It's caused a lot of confusion within the supply chain. There's been a lot of changing goalposts, as I was saying earlier on, which people find very, very frustrating. But it's meant that as I said, we've seen a tangible difference in the number of people who have sort of set targets and action plans. As we see these kind of bits of uncertainty coming through, people go back to the drawing board, change what they're planning to do, and find it harder to get buy-in from their businesses to kind of help to move these processes forward. And also the issue around data sharing and monitoring. Some of the issues we see companies still facing into is because of the lack of any of that kind of set legislation that they know is going to come into place, or they know for definite what's happening. So I think ensuring that there isn't further delays and recognizing that that's one of the things which is blocking progress for the industry is really important as well. So yeah, key messages to take away from today. So I think one of the big things is, yes, we've reached this end of 2025 point, but things haven't been fully achieved. And so trying to maintain momentum moving forwards is going to be incredibly important within your businesses and across the industry generally. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to achieving vDCF. Even in sort of commodity supply chains where we know things like certification have pushed things way further than others, we still see that there's limitations to those routes, and we still see that you can only get so far and then things hit stagnation points. So looking for what those other options are for moving forwards, and not just being wedded to one particular route, I think is becoming increasingly seen as being important by many businesses. And then, looking at shifting action as well towards entry-level controls, so what we're talking about in terms of legislation and things like that, not just relying on downstream actors to influence up the supply chain as well, because we've seen over many years that has its limitations. It can push forward progress, but it does have its limitations, and it needs support of entry-level controls to make sure that everything's moving forwards. So yeah, I'll now hand back over to Sian. I'm sure we've got lots of nice questions to go through.
Brilliant, thank you. We do indeed have a few questions. Do feel free to keep those coming. Hopefully you will found the Q&A box. A couple of quite simple ones to kick off with, and then I will dig into some of the meatier questions. Somebody's asked if they can receive a report of the findings and data. Absolutely yes. We'll be publishing our report next week. So do look out for that. That's got most of what we've covered today in, and a few other little bits that we couldn't quite fit into the hour as well. So worth a read regardless of whether you've been able to attend all of today or not. We've also had somebody ask if the session is being recorded. Yes. If you selected when you signed up to say that you're happy to receive emails from us, we'll send it to you next week along with the report. If you didn't, it will be on the website and you can go and take a look there. I've had a question. Why is it that the segregated deforestation and conversion-free soy supply chains are still limited, whilst almost all major food companies in the UK had committed to verified deforestation and conversion-free? Becky, I'll hand that one over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. Yeah, I think it's a good question, especially when you're looking across the different commodity supply chains and you see, for example, palm having such high levels of segregation. And really, it comes down to a couple of different things. So complexities of the supply chains is one big one. The way that the supply chains operate between palm and soy are so different, and it means that there's a lot of additional complexity within the soy supply chain, which makes it more difficult to do so. There's also elements to do with cost, with availability of ports, with needing to set up, specific shipments from certain ports in order to be able to bring those materials through as segregated. There's lots of different things which contribute towards the kind of overall view of why it is that this is kind of difficult. It is something that many companies have been working on for many years to try and increase that availability of those materials, some through doing things individually within their supply chains, even looking at kind of blockchain technology and agreeing to have specific dedicated shipments, things like that, all the way through to people trying to influence it through, I guess, those kind of industry and sector-wide kind of collaboration groups and discussion groups to look at ways of increasing the kind of view of that. It was something that we were interested to see how EUDR would potentially impact the availability of those materials as well moving forwards. I think the EUDR has there are bits that contribute towards it and bits that actually sort of hinder, which is that we've seen, I guess, an increase in sort of setting up routes for the availability of materials which are verified as deforestation free to meet EUDR requirements, but not necessarily fully vDCF, with the C, the conversion being the important bit as well. So I think we're seeing change in movement, and as you can see from the figures, the proportion that's coming through as being claimed as vDCF is increasing over time, but it's just not increasing to the same point as we've got with, for example, palm supply chains. So hopefully that's a helpful response.
Brilliant. Thank you, Becky. And when I guess a bit more specifically diving into some of those challenges, so somebody said most manufacturers of dairy products are unable to categorically state that the milk they are supplied with are supplied from cattle that have been fed with soy-containing supplements, and they do not know where this is from. How can this be managed? I think, Bella, one for you.
Thank you. As we've said, there's no one size fits all approach to this. I think for manufacturers, it's really important to engage with your suppliers further upstream within the supply chain throughout the year to kind of work on ways to overcome some of the challenges in kind of gaining that visibility of the supply chain. That being said, obviously challenges remain depending on kind of the level of visibility your own suppliers, your direct suppliers have, and kind of also the level of understanding of kind of the theory behind DCF soy within the supply chain. So kind of as we've shown here, Working with feed mills directly is a way that we've been exploring to try and overcome some of those challenges, and ultimately industry level action and government legislation is what's going to be the final push to kind of achieving 100% traceability and 100% DCF within dairy. But there are still things that we can be doing as individual companies to make improvements in that visibility and that performance.
Thanks very much, Bella. We've got another one here specifically on mass balance certification and asking if we can elaborate on that, acknowledging that the mass balance model helps to overcome supply chain challenges and support industry change. So, from your perspective, could we consider mass balance, RTRS, or Proterra as verified deforestation and conversion free? If not, why not? Becky, I might hand that one over to you.
Hello, yes. As I kind of alluded to earlier on, we still see mass balance being really widely used across the commodities, less so within palm, but we see it very much highly used within non-food for palm, so within the use for derivatives and oleochemicals. But we see it as the main mechanism for cocoa, but also a significant mechanism used within soy supply chains as well. It's something that for many businesses, when they were setting out their policies a couple of years ago, they've very much had as part of the roadmap towards vDCF, looking at it as kind of an in transition form of certification, as the question has said, to kind of help to support sustainable production within the region, support producers to do so in a way that is verified deforestation and conversion free, and to allow some of that to be linked through then physically to the supply chain. Just to, I guess, specify here, when we're determining within the report verified deforestation and conversion free, we're doing so in alignment with sort of sector-wide initiatives like the AFI guidance, which specifically talks about segregated forms of certification as being demonstrating verified deforestation and conversion free. Obviously, all of the different companies who are sort of the convening companies who are involved in this process all have their own policies and their own determinations for what meets their requirements for verified deforestation and conversion free. So I think it's also always worth having that conversation with your customers around what it is that they are happy to accept, how it is that they're viewing the different mechanisms within the supply chain, particularly in reality of what those supply chains look like for you and what availability is like, and what the barriers are within your supply chain. We're just aligning behind what the kind of a public form of guidance is that many other schemes and many things align behind, which is AFI on that definition. So again, hopefully that's helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Becky. We've got an evidence question, which I'll put to you, Bella. What do you mean by sufficiency of evidence in soy reporting? Does this refer to whether or not it passes third-party audits?
Yeah, so when we talk about sufficiency of evidence, we're talking about whether documents have been submitted which match what has been reported in a supplier's soy declaration form. So is the company named on the document, named within the form, and is there a clear chain of custody shown within the documentation that we receive, which can be used to kind of prove that a certification or low risk origin claim being made is accurate. Sometimes that evidence gets submitted to auditors, but that's not the rule. Not all of it does.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, it's I guess a kind of indicative rating of what we think, if it was put in front of an auditor, would be able to be seen as sufficient for demonstrating that there has been supply to the grade, for example, of certification, or to the origin, for example, of materials that has been claimed within the overall. We give obviously the convening clients a bit more detail around to what level that is. And as you're going through the process, if you're somebody who does submit to the process, we do also offer kind of guidance and help and support for what that might be, because there are different certification types where different levels of verification, different levels of evidence would be needed, particularly in some commodities like soy, where there is a quite a broad range of different schemes that you might be claiming against for vDCF as well, all of which have different evidence requirements and different expected levels of evidence to come through for them.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've had a bit of a last minute flurry of questions come through. So I think maybe I'll pick one more, Becky, for you to answer in perhaps 1 minute or so, before we move on. Would importing of food products containing soy and its derivatives from all countries need to be verified deforestation and conversion free, or would it be assumed that some countries will not have an issue, for example, soy sourced from China?
Yeah, so this is what we were talking about, those different routes to verify deforestation conversion. And again, what we give here is indicative based on kind of what we see as kind of industry standards and accepted norms across the industry. Each individual company will have their own specific definition on what they do and don't accept. But that kind of low risk origin route, which is what we were talking about earlier on, is definitely something we're seeing come through more and more. We're seeing an increase, for example, in claims of US sourcing and US subnational sourcing from particular regions, or Canadian sourcing, for example, of soy. It's something where there are individual policies that different companies will have as to what meets requirements and what doesn't meet requirements. It's also something that, as part of the RSG model policy, is covered in some form in terms of what a standard approach might be to that. But it's definitely something that we're seeing people use as an alternative way of demonstrating that there is low or negligible risk of deforestation and conversion linked to their materials as a result of where it is that they're coming from, as an alternative to segregated supply chains through certification. I tried to be quick there, Sean, because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions. We'll have our contact details at the end, if you wanted to follow up with any more questions, but I'll hand back over to Becky.
Brilliant. So I guess just one last bit before we log off, to say that we are now already planning and getting things sorted for next year's reporting cycle. This is an annual process that we run through. So we're currently going through the process of shaping what the next evolution of this reporting process is looking like. It's something that we have done for, as we said, 9 years now. So we'll be looking to go forward for our 10th year. But the main aim of it is to try and reduce reporting burden on the suppliers who are within those supply chains by just having one thing they need to go on once a year to do this, but also reducing the reporting burden within those convening companies, where they're able to then trust us to be able to do that on their behalf, rather than needing to use their own internal resource to do it. We've got a lot of established supplier relationships where people have been reporting to us for multiple years, where we speak to them every year, and we know the way that they operate. We know what to expect from them. They know what to expect from us. And also, as we were saying, giving that kind of view of a consistent view from a consistent set of questions, a consistent way of reviewing and validating, to give credible and audit-ready evidence base at the end. So if it is something where you would be interested in getting involved for next year, now is a great time, because we're doing our planning and things at the moment. So please do. My email address is at the bottom. As Sian mentioned, I'm going to be the program manager for the next year's round. So if it's something that you're interested in at all, having a conversation about them, please do just get in touch and let me know. Also, just to flag, we do have a compass, which many of you may not be familiar with, but basically it's a portal which is providing kind of a curated group of intelligence to be able to support companies to take actions within their supply chain, which are data and evidence based. So it includes lots of information on company data and reports, performance and insights into particular actors within supply chains, but also latest news on what's going on within those supply chains. And that at the moment is covering soy, palm and cocoa supply chains, so some of the main actors within those supply chains as well, but looking at what those kinds of issues are that are coming through, trends that we're seeing, but also being able to drill down into specific actors within the supply chain to see what it is that's going on with them, to allow you to kind of build that evidence base to support actions moving forward. So again, if that's something you'd be interested in finding out more about, please do get in touch and let us know. We can send you some more information relating to Compass and what that means, what it looks like, and how you might be able to use it in your business. But otherwise, if you want to get in touch with us for any reason, whether it's onward questions from this process, whether you're a supplier and you want to talk about next year already, or whether you want to reach out to us about anything else linked to any of the services or things that we do, please do get in touch. Our email addresses are on the screen there for you to be able to do so. Also, just a reminder, the recording from today's session, as well as the link to the public report and the ability to download it, that's all going to be uploaded to our website. And if you have said that you are happy to receive email, you will be receiving an email next week with all of that information. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. Perfectly on time. We'll wrap up now, but thank you very much for joining. Thank you for your questions and look forward to speaking to some of you very soon.